Welcome back to week 7. We are in this week in the age of the democratic revolutions. We're looking at the explosion, the revolts, and the revolutions that take place around the Atlantic world in this time frame. And I apologize, I got a little bit of a sore throat, but I'm going to try to get through it, so bear with me. Let's get in. Okay, last week we looked at where does authority or power come from. We said that knowledge, force or might or military and wealth, these are the traditional symbols of power. But as the commercial revolution kind of exploded, military revolution exploded, as information began to be shared and trade interchanged cultures and ideas and knowledge, the knowledge and the might and the wealth started trickling down into the lower levels of what would be traditionally the lower class of people, and caused this middle class to sort of rise up. And more people were gaining the knowledge, gaining the might, gaining the positions of power, and gaining extra wealth. So we saw a shift as people got more money, they got more whatever it might be. They ended up putting more in their pockets. They had more to, live for, so to speak, and they needed to protect it. So their personal interests, their personal liberties, their personal freedoms became much more precious to them, rather than just, bowing down to what the king's interests might have been. And that's what we see during this time. And so we're going to look at how does this sort of play out as we move into the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and eventually into the Latin revolutions as well. So I want to look a little bit of how power sort of transitioned. How did it move? Originally, way back in the day, traditionally, the church held the power because they held the most knowledge. They also had lots of money. So they were the top of the tier. Beneath them were the kings, the rulers, those who had nobility kind of thing. They were the ones that had to sort of bow down to the church and do what the church want, because the church still had ultimate power. And of course, the very bottom of this hierarchy was the peasant, the lower class people. And as information is spread, wealth is spread, we had that, particularly with that mercantile fiscal military state, where the kings made these deals with these trade companies. The trade companies worked with banks to invest in trade, these trade monopolies, and then would kick back money to the king, and the king would end up putting that money into his own armies and navies. That whole cycle, remember? The kings, the upper nobility, began to make some serious money. And what happens is you had a shift from the church being top dog to now the king is now able to tell the church, no, we're not doing it your way. I'm doing it my way. But of course, the peasants are still on the bottom. By the 1760s, there's enough of a middle class, enough of the wealth and the jobs and the positions that the middle class, the lower level of people, are actually rising up. Remember, the personal interests become their concern. They're not as concerned with what the king wants. Now they want to protect their own livelihoods. And so you had this rise up. And so they, in this time frame, in this democratic revolution or explosion, so to speak, they are starting to rethink, well, hey a minute, the king needs to go over and serve a little bit different purpose. It's not all about the king, it's about us too. And so they're wanting a greater and greater voice, a greater and greater attention and protection for what they've gained over these years. That sort of cultural expectation, that hierarchy, the expectations that each person in that hierarchy has, that's called the constituted order. It's not written down. It is not written in law. It's just understood. Everybody knew what the position of the king was. Everybody knew what the nobles did, and et cetera, et cetera. It's sort of like in your house, in your household, your mom, your dad, et cetera, et cetera. Me growing up, it was dad always sat at the head of the table. He was the head of the house. It was a position of honor. And you never would go against dad. You wouldn't, say, nuh-uh, or whatever. It just would not happen. You'd get knocked out of your chair. Mama was second, always to his right, always seated so that she would then have the second place of honor. And you don't ever do anything against mama. You don't disrespect her. You do everything that mama says, because if you don't, then daddy's going to jump in and he's going to get you. And then I, being the oldest of 5 kids, I had my positions of sort of liberties and special rights, shall we say. I could stay up later than my brothers and sisters who were younger than I was. I had more freedom to go about and do what I wanted to do, just as long as I called in to the parents and said, hey, I'm at so-and-so's house, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to be out until like 10, 11 o'clock at night, whatever. That sort of order of things was called a constituted order. That's what they had back before there was this big constitution like we have today with the U.S. Constitution. There was a constituted order. Again, it's not written. It's not like the United States' Constitution, but most European citizens believed that their country had some form of constituted order, some form of constitution, something they could expect, a structure or an organized set of laws or social expectations that they could rely upon. For definition's sake, because you want to take these in your notes, constitution or constitution order is the accumulation of privileges, liberties, of traditionally protected or traditional protections in which everybody in society has his or her own place or order, their position. So if I'm living in London, I have special privileges within London that people living in Paris do not have in London. Kind of make sense? Okay. Now, here's another definition you got to get a hold of. In order to understand democratic revolution, you got to understand despotism and tyranny. So despotism and tyranny this is an environment in which the ruler sort of ignores or violates the constituted order. He violates the privileges and liberties and traditional social order of those who are beneath him. So if a king tells a London citizen that he no longer has any particular rights in London, that's a violation of order, and or a violation of the liberties. So that king is then viewed as a despot or a tyrannical ruler. It's a bad negative. They're not faithful to that constituted order and expectation. Now, mind you, not all kings were considered despots or tyrannical rulers. There were some that were very good and noble and treated their people well. But out of this sort of growth of this middle class and this influx of wealth and position and power, there rose what we call intermediaries. Now, this is another definition that you got to get a hold of, because you're not going to understand democratic revolution unless you get this part. So intermediaries sort of sounds like in-betweeners, the ones that are in between the king and the lower level people. And that's exactly what these folks are. These are notable citizens within a society who believe that they possess certain privileges and liberties. They are accustomed to them based on their position or their citizenship. Kind of going back to the guy that lives in London and is a citizen of London. He expects certain rights and certain privileges, certain protections for his liberty. The police will come and protect his right if somebody tries to steal his or rob his store. A lot of times these are positions of a little bit of power. So you got city council people, you have people who are in parliament, people who are governors of certain towns or regions, county clerks, guild members of different trade unions and things like that. These people made up the new intermediaries. It wasn't just that little high, thin little courtiers, the little people who were at the ball and stuff like that. This was more, it had a little bit more robustness to it, more people. It might be the merchant who has kind of worked his way up through the ranks and now has a pretty good trade agreement going on with the king or with some people. It might be a shipbuilder, things like that. Some artisans might fit into this category as well. But who made up these intermediaries? What qualified them to be there? Well, in part, of course, noble. If you were born into a noble family, that immediately puts you into that intermediary category. Priests, church leaders, that would definitely put you into an elite kind of category. You're a little higher up. You have a little bit more power of position than others. But and here's the interesting part during this time frame, as the trade is building, military is building, and we got this middle class building up. There are a few people who in the past were not noble, were not in the priesthood, that are now making money, and money buys them offices and position. Daddy worked really, really, really hard. He's got now lots of money. He's the wealthiest man in town. So he buys his son a position as governor or mayor of a city. That would be how the new intermediaries were sort of formed. This is new money, not old ancient money. This is new money that's coming out of the commercial revolution. This group of people, this intermediary group, was then called and labeled the aristocracy. The aristocracy is from the Greek, for all of you geeky nerds and language nerds. It's aristos, which means the best, the most virtuous, the most noble, and then kratia, which is rule or power. So aristocracy is the rule or the power of the noblest of people. So you got this kind of snobbish kind of attitude. But these are the upper class. These are the people that are now making up the power and the shakers and the movers. They were very elite, very exclusive ruling class. You could not just, get elected into it. That didn't happen. You were still very, very restricted of who could serve as an intermediary. But that group is growing. So where do the struggles sort of, arise? Well, it really arises between the king, who is now kind of like above the church. He's getting the more money. He's building his armies and his might. And so he's battling against the church's knowledge, perhaps, because he's got money and he's got might. He's got two of the three. So the people that are now going to oppose him or are going to start getting frustrated with the king's agenda is the aristocracy, those intermediaries. I called them parliament here because we're going to see how parliament later sort of rises up against the king. So when it says parliament here, think intermediaries. These are the upper class nobles, these new nobles. So the king has his agenda. His agenda is he wants the general welfare of the kingdom. That's his responsibility. He wants the kingdom to do well, to thrive, be robust, be able to fight anybody that comes against it. Parliament, these intermediaries, remember, they're more personal welfare, personal liberties. Well, what happens when the two goals clash? The king wants to raise taxes so that he can go over and pay for his armies and for a particular war. And the nobles are saying, you can't tell me that you're just going to demand my money. That's my money, my liberty, my freedom. I worked hard for that. You don't have the right to just walk in and demand it. So you had this clashing between the two. This was not a clash with a little person who's kind of going, I want to have a vote. This is not about voting. This is about power. Who's going to have power? And that's what's going to roll into these democratic revolutions. The revolution begins in the mind and in the heart and the perceptions of what people's expectations are of the constituted order that are going to roll into then action. And that action will end up in, like what we would normally call a revolution, military fighting. And I believe we're going to get that in our next video, so stand by.